Thank you, Patrick.
How you been?
I've been pretty good.
Yeah.
Traveling, enjoying my summer.
Yeah.
Catching up on reading and all sorts of things.
Did you watch the greatest Tour de France of our lifetime?
I did not, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Will you tell me about it?
It is unfortunate. Julian Alaphilippe is the man, but, had like the brave hero's death at the end. Made it all the 401 odds, made it all the way to stage 19 of 21 with the leader's jersey, but then, he fell apart, but it was kind of inevitable. But, I basically decided if he had won that race, it would have been like an 11 out of 10 tour. Instead, it was just a 9 out of 10.
Okay.
9 even, not like 0.1 or anything, just 9 even, because it could have been like a 9.4 or 5-ish. They had to shorten 2 stages at the end because of landslides.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But that kind of diminished Egan Bernal, who is this 22-year-old Colombian who won.
Mm-hmm.
First Colombian to win. Youngest tour winner since way before World War II. So
wow,
pretty impressive. But it would have been even more impressive if they had finished the stages because he would have crushed everybody by even more. But he didn't get.
Because he's good at distance.
Well, no, he was on the attack. He had already broken away from everybody. He was putting time into people. But then it's then they were on the descent. And it's there's a half-mile stretch of ice coming up, so we have to call this stage. There's no way they can cross this. Plus, there was a landslide at one point, too. It's you can't ride across this.
Yeah, it sounds brutal.
Yeah. But other than that, it was a good tour. And there's nothing they could do. They had to cancel it, obviously. I'm not saying they shouldn't have, but
okay.
Maybe I don't know. The luck just didn't play for it, and it's it's only a 9 out of 10. But still the best of our lifetime.
Cool. Because
we were not born before 1989. Because that one's still probably better.
Yeah.
But this one. Julian Alaphilippe, he made the race. I love guys like that. That's a theme of my favorite Grand Tours I've ever watched. The top 4 of the top 5 all have somebody that had an epic collapse. And this is actually the least epic of them, but it was pretty good. All right, let's start here. What are we doing today?
Today we're going through the prologue to Lord of the Rings. So, if you remember, the last episode was the foreword, which is Tolkien himself writing about the writing of the book. The prologue is now in the mindset of the story, basically, but giving us background before we dive into the actual plot.
Yeah, so the prologue just has basically just a bunch of stuff about hobbits mostly, and so we're just going to dive into it. A couple of things we're going to talk about are we'll talk about our initial thoughts, how it compares to The Hobbit. We'll talk about traits of hobbits, history of hobbits, how the Shires run, what else? Recount the ring a little bit, and then we'll finally dive into what account of this Lord of the Rings tale we're about to read. Who's the real author of this besides Tolkien?
Right.
We thought about doing Cliff's Notes, but we kind of decided against it because we're actually going to just hardcore dive into a lot of the details here just so that everybody has it going forward in case you somehow didn't read the prologue.
But just as a summary, the prologue is broken into 4 parts. We have hobbits, pipeweed, the ordering of the Shire, and the finding of the ring. And then there's a 5th section about the record keeping of the Shire. It's a little bit shorter. So, hobbits. We've talked a bit about hobbits before.
No.
Right?
Initial thoughts.
Okay, sorry. Initial thoughts. It struck me as sounding. It still has his distinct Tolkien voice, kind of faintly humorous. Not being comical, but the way that he alludes to, but the hobbits evade us big folk nowadays, and it might seem like magic to us, but it's really just a studied craft for them. It has his similar tone and his references, but it also struck me as being more procedural, maybe. He's running through a ton of information in this section that's presented very efficiently.
Yeah, I agree with the procedural, and it's almost like academic a little bit.
Right.
Or academic for the layperson, at least.
It struck me as without really knowing what sort of texts Tolkien was reading as a professor, the type of thing that you might have read describing a work, like if you're doing some linguistic archaeology, like this translation of this story from the 1200s, we found it in this condition, but we have evidence to suggest that this author may have added a version to this story. Part of the text was missing, but going off of an early reference, we found this part of the text. These types of, like, I consider it like the archaeology of the story or something like that I could imagine in an academic setting that Tolkien might have read or wrote in referring to some of the stuff that he was studying. And he's putting this in that context for us.
Right. And so in addition to all that, what comes with it is just a ton of names.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. So just to be clear, too, like we said, there's no more like, of course, this is how you talk to trolls or behave with wizards or, how you talk to a dragon when you see one.
Mm-hmm.
So all that crap is gone.
This is much less grandfather sitting near the fire talking to the kids and more... Yeah, this is like akin to an academic study of a work of literature or something like that.
Right. And now the names are also they're more evolved and more original than just the hill or the water.
Mm-hmm.
Lake Town or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or Rivendell. To get into it a little bit too, I think the best thing to look at just at the beginning of the story would be the maps, compare the maps. So if you look at the Hobbit map, it was always just kind of... It was pretty looking, but it kind of just had all the information that you need. Maybe a couple cool little drawings or references to something at the edges of the map, but, nothing really important. Whereas if you look at the Lord of the Rings map, you're starting to get filled with just everything. Tons and tons of information about stuff. And it's kind of interesting, too, because that's somewhat of a... It evolves throughout his stories, but then it also evolves throughout real life too, because, at some point in history, stuff was just, the big mound near your house was probably just called the hill, or the big lake that was a few miles around was called the lake, and the town on it was Lake Town, and the land filled with Scottish people was just Scotland,
Right. I mean, yeah, a lot of English words or things that we think of as being complex words are just agglomerations of little pieces. Like, I don't know what a good example would be. But, like, you look at an English map and many of the names on there, like Southampton or something like that, tends to be like a geographic reference. And then a shortening of things like ton is often short for town or something like that. There's very few proper nouns mixed in there.
Yeah, but now we get to the point where when we use names today, they're just basically labels for people. So like that's kind of how the naming's evolved. So, I mean, you can think like what your name means, and it's like, oh, maybe you live up to that, but you're just labeled as an individual person with your name a little bit. Right.
You're saying there's less emphasis on the actual meaning of the word.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. So. On the map, talk to me about what I picked up reading the prologue is that at some point the hobbits originated or were living further towards what I would call the middle of the map from the story of the Hobbit, where they're to the east of the Misty Mountains, somewhere near or to the east of the Anduin. That's the big river flowing through the middle of the map. North-south.
I think they're on the Anduin, in between the Anduin and the Misty Mountains.
Okay.
So it would have been...
near Mirkwood.
Well, actually near Bjorn's house, but then kind of further south. But yes, near Mirkwood, because Bjorn's house is near Mirkwood.
Right, but at the time, Mirkwood wasn't Mirkwood. It was still Greenwood before it got murky.
Yeah. All right, well, Clifford...
But something made them move west. They moved over the Misty Mountains, and now they're inhabiting... this territory that's somewhere between the map that we know from The Hobbit and basically the west coast of Middle-earth, where the Grey Havens are, right?
Right.
They're in this, kind of agricultural rolling hills land with rivers and mountains to the east, and if you go pretty far to the west, the ocean.
Yeah, Clifford, which way do you want to do this? Do you want to talk about hobbits first, or should we talk about like the history of how they got to the Shire?
Let's talk about hobbits first. I'm sorry if I diverged. We were talking about the map a little bit.
I mean, I could do it either way, yeah. But yeah, right. That is, yeah. I guess we'll come back to that part.
So on hobbits, one thing I was going to say earlier is we should be fairly familiar with hobbits. If you listen to our episodes on The Hobbit, we gave a bit of an introduction to hobbits at the beginning, what we know about them, what we gleaned from the opening of The Hobbit. Tolkien repeats some information here and gives us a little bit more background on hobbits. Anything that stood out to you, Patrick?
Yeah, let's see. What did we not know before? Or should we go back through some details that we kind of did know before? Well, anyways, some things I picked up. It makes very clear love, peace, and quiet. We kind of figured that about Bilbo already, though. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're craftsmen, not engineers. That was kind of implied based on who Tolkien is himself, you know?
Right.
But, I mean, hobbits, like, that's basically close to explicitly said. Like,
yeah,
they don't like anything more evolved than, like, a watermill or something.
Yeah.
They just like to use their own tools and do stuff by hand.
Right. It's like you can imagine kind of primitive metalworking, woodworking, but not steam engines or heavy machinery.
Yeah. Height, so we officially got a range. It's 2 to 4 feet. But the tallest one was like 4'5" and could ride a horse. On average, they lived to be 100, which is a couple of decades higher than our average, I'd say. Makes sense compared to when they come of age, which we'll find out in the first chapter.
Right.
We know about brown curly hair. We know they like red and green clothes from like The Hobbit.
Bare feet with furry tops.
Yeah, skillful fingers. That was a cool detail. Good-natured, bright-eyed, red-cheek faces. 6 meals a day. Okay, hobbits.
Impressive.
Hobbits are never warlike nor fought each other, so that's kind of interesting. That's they're doing better than men on that. They rarely quarreled, never hunted for sport, but I do think they hunt a lot, but could still handle weapons at need.
On the warlike note, I noticed a lot of these descriptions, I thought Tolkien was deliberately setting up like a Goldilocks characteristic. For a lot of these things, he's qualifying it like they're never warlike, but they can handle weapons when they need to. Or, you know, they are kind of pudgy, but they are swift and nimble when they need to be. Or they don't like machinery, but they are good craftsmen. I felt like a lot of the descriptions were kind of this perfect medium between being talented but not going towards any extremes. Like they're very like middling, not average in a boring way, but very average in terms of these characteristics.
I mean, maybe he didn't just want to like insult them or make the rest of the story unrealistic if they ever do something like big.
He's setting himself up for possibilities,
I guess, yeah. But it does almost sound like he's being a little too explicit about setting himself up. I mean, I still like it though, and I mean,
we know that they're sturdy, can handle. They're good survivors, although they like the easy life.
And we already referenced it at the beginning, but we're gonna talk about who's like writing this, as if somebody in Middle Earth is like writing this account, and like who is that? So that person, maybe they're trying to explain to their audience, because everybody in the audience will know what they go on to do. So it's like, how is this believable? But it's like, well, they've always, had weapons. They just never had to use them, but they know how to, But most of their weapons, as they said, are like, it's what you put over your mantelpiece as like, your decoration. Yeah.
The local policemen have more to do with making sure the livestock don't run away than anything else.
Finding like stray cats and stuff. All right. A couple other things about hobbits, just to just keep going through this. Originally, all hobbits lived in holes, but now only the richest and the poorest. So Bilbo is one of the richer ones. It makes sense that he does.
But they inhabited inherited, not inhabited, inherited that characteristic from dwarves, right?
I don't think so. I think that's what they were doing near the Anduin, just to remember. Okay. Yeah. In the flat districts, they built houses of wood, brick, and stone. And then round windows and doors are distinct hobbit architecture. So, Clifford, as the architect of the podcast, advantages and disadvantages of round doors and windows.
It's very peculiar. It's very interesting. But I would say that there's not much precedent for that in the real world, in part because think about a circular door and how you put hinges on it.
I know. I was wondering. I feel like that'd be the disadvantage part.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very difficult. That said, if you're building underground, it's very easy to dig things in circles or with curves than it is to make them nice and square. So that makes a lot of sense.
Do you just have to use one really strong hinge?
Yeah, you'd have to use either one strong hinge at the end, or you'd have to do a pivot. But as we saw from the Lord of the Rings movies, they definitely suggested it was on a hinge. A pivot door could be pretty cool. Round windows are a little bit easier, obviously.
Are those easier to open, though? I feel like those are a problem when you try to open them.
I'd say it's probably on a pivot. Like it kind of rotates out.
Yeah.
Or it's like a ship porthole type thing.
Right, okay. All right, cool. Well, interesting. Is that it, though? Those are the no advantages, just disadvantages?
No. Advantages, I don't know if I have any distinct advantage. It lends like a very organic, natural feel to their architecture. It's like this balance between them being rabbits living in burrows and modern Englishmen or something like that. It's like a refined but very humble situation.
Okay.
That's my thought.
Acceptable, Clifford. Acceptable. All right, let's keep going. The great families live among all their generations in like a big mansion of many tunnels. It's kind of like the ancestral seat of each clan. Their version, I don't know. You can't really call them castles because these people aren't like that wealthy, but yeah, it's getting close to it. They all have elaborate family trees, and they actually care about it, even though it's admittedly dull by close to everybody. There's the one quote: "Hobbits delighted in such things if they were accurate. They like to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square with no contradictions." Okay. Most hobbits don't like rivers and small boats, nor can most swim. Okay, so they don't like water either. Or it's
right.
In it. Yeah.
Although we get continuous allusions to some hobbits, particularly the Tooks, being a little bit more adventurous than others. And maybe that because they've been settled for a long time in the Shire, they've slowly forgotten or moved towards this more stationary lifestyle where adventure is dangerous and risky, even though at one time they were a little bit more bold.
Well, yeah, so let's actually talk about their history now, because that might actually be from which, I guess, breed of hobbit. I think he was using the word breed, because there was three groups or different types of hobbits originally before they came to the Shire.
Right.
So why don't we dive in and just, set out the details of that. So what we were saying before, they come from near Bjorn's house a little bit, kind of close to there, probably a little bit south of there. Go I don't know, 100 miles south, let's say. Maybe not.
Okay.
Many miles south. Okay, so there's three breeds of them. So we had the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Fallowhides. All right. Did you write any of the differences down between them? I can take it.
Yeah, no. So basically, the Harfoots are described as a little bit smaller, shorter, nimble, live in the mountains and hillsides, darker skin.
Yeah.
The Stores are broader and heavier, feet and hands are larger, and they like flatlands and riversides. And the Fallowhides are fairer of skin and hair, and also tall and thin, and they like trees. So I thought that was kind of a funny but also very fitting depiction of trees are tall and thin in the forest. So hence the ones who inhabit the forest are more tree-like. And then the people who are broad and flat live in lands that are broad and flat. And then the kind of scrabbly, scrawny ones live in the more scrabbly terrain. For me, that feels very quintessentially Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah.
The landscape is directly tied to the people who exist in it. Or you know what I mean?
I agree. Totally agree. Good observation, Clifford. I'll also say too, three tribes. You see three tribes a lot in Tolkien. The most notable is probably the elves in the Silmarillion. When they come to Valinor, there's three tribes of those. And we're going to address that once we get through this a little bit more too. I had some other notes. So the Harfoots, they dealt with dwarves a lot. They were the first to come to Eriador. It's the region in between, basically the Shire and Rivendell are part of it, but they're kind of somewhere in the middle of there. Just go with that. Okay.
Okay.
So that's Eriador, which means they crossed the Misty Mountains, which must have been like hard for hobbits, I guess. You know, most numerous and normal representative of hobbits. Okay, so they're like the standard brand. And then the Stores lingered by the Anduin for a little bit, and they could actually grow facial hair too, which was interesting. But eventually they crossed over the Misty Mountains further south, and then kind of had to come north to meet the other hobbits, basically. And then the Fallowhides were the least numerous, and they were more friendly with elves and more skilled in language and song, as opposed to like being craftsmen. But they liked hunting and tilling. So they mingled with the Stores and the Harfoots and were more bolder and adventurous, ended up becoming the leader of clans. So, you know,
Right.
I think he even makes a point to say there's a Fallowhide strain in the Tooks and the Brandybucks, which are two of the famous families who will meet in this book for sure.
Right.
So, yeah, what were you saying before about the Tooks?
Yeah, and since being settled in the Shire, we get the suggestion that hobbits are now a little suspicious of adventure and don't really believe it anymore. But at one time, that might have been more widespread.
Right, and well, yeah, the Tooks as a whole are kind of just the most revered family, but they're also like the quirkiest. But I think they're probably the most revered because they are just the most adventurous, because they have like they're like the natural leaders of all the hobbits, basically.
Right. I feel like you get maybe an early, like Tolkien's laying the groundwork early on for boldness as an asset. You know, like these bold ones who are a little bit of quirky outliers end up being the accomplished ones who push the narrative forwards.
Right.
He certainly has an affinity for like the outliers or the underdogs.
All right, so they're all in Eriador. At this point, there's a great kingdom of men, but it's dwindling and quickly decaying. And we'll address what that kingdom is throughout this series, but, you know, we don't want to spoil it a little bit. Okay, so, and it's not really important for our purposes. It's just a king of men or whatnot. And so one of the first Hobbit settlements was at this town called Bree, which, just look at the map where Bree is. Again, we'll address what Bree is in depth throughout this podcast. 40 miles east of it is the Shire. And about this time, legend among the hobbits first became history with the reckoning of years. So before this, you know, they had just been wandering people, but now it's like, okay, let's actually start writing down important historical stuff that's happened.
So they started their timeline once they crossed over the Branduin?
Well, so in 1601 of the Third Age, Marco and Marco? What should I go with? Marco?
Sure.
Yeah, Marcho and Blanco set out from Bree with the permission of the High King to cross the Branduin, which is the Brandywine, the great following of hobbits. And so from there, they started, when they crossed the Brandywine, they started marking it as year one of Shire reckoning. Now, there's some hobbits in Bree that stayed back, and so the Bree hobbits start calling these people colonists at this point, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so that's when, okay, so they move into what we know as the Shire. Does your book have a Shire map? Mine does.
Mine does. I actually don't have an overall map. I just have a Shire map right now.
Your overall map might be in the back of the book.
Okay, I'll check. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, anyways, so this is where they move into the Shire, and that's the map there.
Okay, I've got the good zoomed out one is probably the most descriptive. So the way I thought is the easiest for me to visualize is you've got kind of running through the middle of the map, north-south, is the Anduin.
Yeah.
And just to the left of that, you've got a long mountain chain, of which at least part is the Misty Mountains. I don't know if the whole thing counts as Misty Mountains.
Yeah, it is.
And to the right side is Mirkwood.
Yeah.
The Anduin is I consider like the backbone or the spine of the map for most of the story.
Okay, yeah.
So in The Hobbit, it's like that's kind of like the middle mark. They travel from the left side, the west side of the map, across the mountains and the river and the forest, over to the east side to the Lonely Mountain, and then back. And then for the Lord of the Rings, we'll see, but the Anduin is like a very easy to remember. It's the big river, and it's like the midpoint.
Yeah, that or
like
the Misty Mountains. I think both of them work as your kind of divider. Yeah.
Reference point.
Yep, totally agree.
But Eriador is this big chunk of land off to the west of the Misty Mountains.
Yep, and it basically goes basically all the way to the sea until you see that other mountain range in the far north of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the hobbits, yeah, most maps will have the Shire, so you should see it. Should we talk a little bit about the function, how the Shire functions a little bit, and then we can actually finally say, like, what was the point of this whole prologue? You know?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Okay, so mostly families just kind of manage themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And lots of people were just subsistence farmers, unless they were some kind of craftsmen who just, then they would have to just buy their stuff from everybody else. But yeah. Mm-hmm. And then there was the king, the king of men, and he lived in a town called Fornost, which, but he's been gone. By the time of Bilbo, he's been gone for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. But they still remember his laws.
Is there the suggestion that he ruled over them?
He was in charge of them, but his only command was just make sure the bridges and roads are maintained, and you can live there, and you can basically kind of just rule yourselves. There might have been one person that like answered to him, and there was like a couple battles where they sent troops to aid him.
Okay.
Because that's kind of that's a very medieval thing, was you had to send your troops right to live on the land.
But at this in the current setting, it sounds like they're mostly agrarian, like. They spend most of their time growing food and eating it.
Yep.
Although there's craftspeople, we get the suggestion of towns, although nothing sounds all that dense. There's some nature of like class divisions, like there's wealthier and poorer hobbits.
Yep.
Certainly these wealthy old families are like they're like the established. They define how the society's broken up, it seems like.
Yeah, they had a couple actual like government roles. There was the nominal leader, like title of the Thane, which was basically who's ever the head of the Took household.
Right.
And he was almost like the commander-in-chief in emergencies.
A leader of a militia.
Yeah, but I wouldn't even say militia. I'd almost say like their army. Like,
well, that's what they only muster in time of need. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think militia is a little bit. That's not a medieval word.
Okay.
I don't know. Like militia, I think of like Minutemen. Like Revolutionary War stuff. But I think it was. I don't know. They haven't even needed it for a long time.
Okay.
So,
yeah, and at this point, it's
just a ceremonial title.
Yeah, symbolic role.
Yeah. Now there was actually a mayor, and he lived on the west end of it, and that's not even Micheldelding, and that's basically kind of just like a museum almost, and that's not on many of the maps. Yeah, the only thing he had to do was basically preside over banquets on holidays. Mm-hmm. And then he also had to manage the postmen and the sheriffs. So the postmen, so they did have mail, as we'll see in the first chapter, and then the sheriffs were the police, but they had a feather in their cap, and that was about it. And then there was no crime, so they just had to keep their eye on strangers coming across,
and then at the very end we get this faint reference to some sort of border patrol that is not all that big, but they've had to step it up recently because there's strange happenings and odd sightings of creatures on the edges of the Shire.
Well, there's also these notes here that I thought were interesting. They heeded the outside world less and less until they thought peace and plenty were the rule and right of all of Middle Earth. Like they thought they were owed peace and plenty.
Right. They kind of have slowly forgotten some of the trickier parts of their past.
Yeah, it says they forgotten the guardians with a capital G making the long peace possible. They couldn't even remember that they're being sheltered. Which those are all like, I don't know, those are interesting notes there that we'll have to remember as we begin the book, because that's
this goes back to my earlier thought of like the kind of Goldilocks situation with their government, where it sounds like they have no real government, there's no king, but they have still like the trappings of aspects of governance and society, like the post office and the border patrol folks, and like there's enough order that things are orderly, but not enough that there's like strong control or the presence of the state or anything.
So that I think we'll talk about in a future chapter 2, where we can actually like see it functioning. But that was like probably Tolkien's ideal government. I wouldn't say that's everybody's, but it
seemed like sort of a pastoral ideal for him.
Right. Just really quick with the pipeweed section, just because put a whole section in about it.
Yeah, which was kind of funny. We've got these fundamental, what are hobbits, how are they governed, how is their land organized, and then pipeweed.
Well, if we remember from The Hobbit, it wasn't called pipeweed, it was called what?
Weed?
No, it's just tobacco, like straight.
Okay.
But tobacco is obviously a not British word.
What is the origin of tobacco? I don't actually know.
I think it comes from the New World, and I mean tobacco is a New World invention.
Right.
That's why he's, as we're about to see, like what he's doing here. But he wanted hobbits to be the inventors of it, so that he can. Well, I guess we kind of got to spoil the jig what he's doing here. Of all the descriptions that we just said, you're supposed to read this, and maybe it's hard for Americans, but you're supposed to read this and be like, oh, this is England. And then these hobbits are just different English people who are short, That's basically all he's going for with this whole prologue. But the pipeweed is like, well, we got to have that, but, because English people smoke tobacco, like he did, I guess, too. And he even says it comes from Nicotiana, but he couldn't make it from the New World because that doesn't fit. So he's like, all right, well, we'll just have this be a Hobbit original invention. But he doesn't say the plant. He said they're the first ones to put it in a pipe and smoke it. And it comes from a plant, but he doesn't say the plant is native to the Shire. He says it comes from either the south or from Numenor, which was across the sea, like an island out at sea there, which is interesting. But the Hobbits' contribution to history up until this point was they were the first ones to put it into pipes. And then dwarves, rangers, wizards got hooked on it, and men would smoke it too, and that was all a Hobbit invention.
Yes. Yeah. I thought it was kind of funny. A lot of the language sounds much more like marijuana than tobacco, like using weed very liberally, and also like the finest homegrown, that type of thing. Yeah, if it weren't for his explicit references to Nicotiana or something like that, it seems suggestive of marijuana to me.
Well, did some of those like the marijuana talk, I mean, could that possibly have developed off of Lord of the Rings? Because I mean, this was first.
I don't actually know. I don't know what the
Yeah, I'm not really going to speculate too far into that.
Yeah,
I'm also not that interested. But all right, but yeah. So what he was really doing for this whole thing, he was making the Shire feel like England. That was his whole point. And we kind of already have talked about that with Bilbo in the Hobbit. Like, he was supposed to be anachronistic and he was supposed to be relatable to the English readers. And, he had like the Tea Party in the first chapter or whatnot. But now he's doing this on like the broader scale for the Hobbit.
Right. It's like it's both representative and fantastical. So for the English reader, you have elements that are familiar and relatable, aspects that are nostalgic, and aspects that might be completely unreal but still fit in with this like kind of mythology,
Yeah, so in Tom Shippey's books, he kept using the term calking. So the definition of it is a linguistic term to mean that process in which the elements of a compound word are translated bit by bit to make it a new word in another language. So an example of this is, I had to look it up because I don't speak other languages, unfortunately. I had to look up, so I got Flammenwaffe, which is a German word. And so then from there, we took the Flammen, the flame part, and then we took the thrower part, and we just made the English word flamethrower. So that's an example of it.
Okay.
So that's basically what he's doing here is he's taking bits of English names and places and history and renaming it or rephrasing them into English-esque American country, which is the Shire here.
Gotcha.
All right.
Piecemeal recreation.
Right. They're all just supposed to be like just spitting image. Not so much like London, but the part where he's from, like around Birmingham, like which is I guess called the West Midlands, which is like the countryside, but still English, not quite Welsh. And we had mentioned before, we mentioned those the Marco and Blanco guy leading everybody in,
right?
And so they're based off two people that we've slightly already talked about. But do you remember Hengest and Horsa?
You'll have to remind me.
Yeah, I thought I would. All right, so you remember, what's it called? The Book of Lost Tales one that we did? Yeah, so there's Ariel. Is that how we're saying it? Ariel. Oh, gosh, we got this And so, well, anyway, so you remember him. So, like, he was supposed to be wandering, and then eventually the Lonely Isle is supposed to get moved and it becomes Great Britain, And then he has two sons, Hengest and Horsa. So Hengest means stallion. Horsa just means horse. Marcho means horse and Blanco means white horse. So, you know, Hengist and Horsa are real life well, actually probably real life people. They're the mystical people that led the Anglo-Saxon migration to Great Britain at like the end of like the Roman Empire, so like 400s AD, you know. And so that's what Marco and Blanco are doing when they lead a migration of people to set up the Shire. You know, this is all just a spitting image of like, so he's even recreating the history basically.
Right.
As he sets this up.
One little thing that stuck out to me, this is a completely random, unsubstantiated speculation, but when he's describing the land and them taking on the common speech, he kind of references like all across the land from Belfalas to Lune.
Yeah.
Which like just if I was like reading quickly, looked like Belfast and London or something like that, which is like
you go that far.
Well, maybe. I mean, but
Belfast and Belfast look like
definitely. But I was like hypothetically, like that's the top left corner of the UK over to the bottom right corner, roughly.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Well,
it was just a very vague thing, but I was like, it felt like a faint English reference to me.
That's a little bit of a stretch. What about this? By Shire reckoning, by the time we get to Bilbo, or actually more so by the time we get to Frodo, they're in the 1400s, like right around like 1400 even, about maybe like 10 years past that, or I think it's actually 17, but whatever. Hengist and Horsa in Anglo-Saxon times moved over around 400 or 500. So if we go with 500, because that's probably, I don't know, it's probably, you know, it's in the 400s, but like late 400s.
Right.
And if you add 1400 years of that, you get to like 1900s, which was when Tolkien lived.
Right.
So it's like, the Shire is just as old as England is too. Like they're the same age, which is kind of interesting. And you remember too, like he had wanted to when he originally set out writing the Lost Tales, he had wanted to make the mythology for England. But, you know, basically that became just unworkable, and like the Silmarillion had to evolve into something else, and it's just like the backbone of the mythology. But this is like the one little shadow that he still gets to do is he can make his home of the West Midlands in England. He can make that the Shire, which is cool that he got something in there. So, yeah. And the three tribes, you know, the Harfoots, the Stores, and the Falahides. That's just like the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes, which were the main three tribes to migrate over to England. And so that's like, anytime you see like the three tribes moving west, you know, we see that with hobbits, we've seen that with elves, you see that with men. It's all probably based off that.
Interesting.
Plus, European migrations in general, everybody moved west, you know, which is obvious because they came from like either Africa or the Middle East, and then they just moved west. But there were multiple migrations too. But
overlapping each other.
Yeah, so that either has to do with it's a shout out to the Anglo-Saxons and stuff, or it's a shout out to the people moving west, which might have been like driven somewhat by just stargazing almost. Like they wanted to keep going as far west as they could. Right. But it's like I haven't really dived into that, but that's what I've heard a little bit. I guess just to finish this part off, Tolkien said to an interviewer here, he said, hobbits are just rustic English people, made small in size because it reflects the generally small reach of their imaginations. And yeah, like we were saying before, they've forgotten that the outside world even exists. You know, they think just being comfortable is the rule. Right. Should we move on?
Yes. The Finding of the Ring.
All right, Finding the Ring. We can't spend too much time on this because we kind of already covered it twice.
Right, exactly.
So either go to Chapter 5 of The Hobbit or our Hobbit Leftovers episode.
I thought basically just a blow-by-blow for those who wanted a little bit of a refresher. It reminded me of like when you watch some TV shows now and it's like, previously on...
Yeah.
The Hobbit. Bilbo finds a ring in the cave. It was a little bit of a quick recap for everyone.
Well, actually, ancient stories used to do that too. I learned that. Like that's like that happens in the Bible a lot. Like there'll be like the end of Genesis had like Joseph. You know, the Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat story. You know, he was the last one there, and so like Exodus starts off with, like yeah, so Joseph had led all of Jacob's family into here,
In the previous episode.
Yeah, but that's exactly what the Bible's like. That's what they're doing, is say like, all right, read this book after you've read this one.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also if you think about most of this stuff like coming out of a narrative oral tradition where you've got like a bard or something telling us like one story a night or something like that, often has to remind an audience like, by the way, so you remember this story and we're picking up here. But anyways, one thing that struck me from this description of Bilbo finding the ring is we have allusions to the Red Book, and we start to get into what basically seems to me like this discussion or references to like, what text are we reading? What text is The Hobbit? What text is this prologue? That sort of thing. And it seemed as though Tolkien has basically worked into the story what we discussed previously on The Hobbit about there being a second edition. Once he decides he's writing Lord of the Rings, he revises the finding of the ring to fit in with the story. You know what I mean? And he's basically given us, he said, well, so the first edition of The Hobbit, effectively, is the story that Bilbo told to his compatriots and is what he wrote down. But Bilbo and Samwise, in their later histories, found out the real truth and wrote down a different version, but they didn't want to delete anything that that Bilbo had written.
But the different version is the real thing that really happened, and that's the version that most people read, which is the second edition.
But I thought the whole thing was kind of fascinating because Tolkien was just like, he's woven in the actual timeline of like, in real life, different versions of The Hobbit being published into the narrative.
Yeah, and that was... he was originally, I think when he was originally doing this, he didn't know that they were going to release a second edition of The Hobbit. He just kind of sent in notes or whatever, just like correction stuff, and he put that whole thing in there. And then they kind of printed it without him knowing, and so he's like,
really?
Cool. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, so like some of this might not have even been deliberate. Like he was probably just going to he was probably going to assume that there wouldn't be a second edition, and he was just going to say like, well, the real story is this right here in the prologue. And we didn't change this because we want to keep Bilbo's account, his own, and just like, fine. But here's the real story, which descendants found out later. The only other things from that section that I thought were interesting was they said the whole Hobbit saga, including Smaug's death and the Battle of Five Armies, would have only been a footnote in history if not for Bilbo finding the ring. Well, I think it could be more than a footnote. That's a little weak. I mean, it's not as grand as the story we're about to read, but I mean, it's like... It's a little more than that.
Right. But the Red Book that is referred to in the prologue is The Hobbit?
I think it's going to be The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. We're going to get into that in a second, too. The only other thing that I do have to, just want to mention, because I think we debated over this, many moons ago, is it says, the authorities, with a capital A, differ if the last was a riddle or just a question. That's Bilbo's, like, what's in my pocket?
Yeah, the authorities being Patrick and Clifford on their podcast.
Well, anyways, but I'll agree it was a fair play that Gollum accepted it and then had to answer. So there we go. That I think that kind of settles the matter. So Bilbo didn't cheat, even though it's questionable, but since Gollum accepted,
Right, exactly.
It did have a couple things in here that I just thought were interesting. So when Bilbo got back, Frodo's the only one that knows the real story, which Frodo's his heir. They said that. They didn't introduce him yet, but whatever. All right. Okay. And he believed no other hobbits knew about the ring. And then, so what happened to all this stuff on his stuff? So Bilbo has the ring. No other hobbits know about it. He put Sting above his wall, above his fireplace. And then his dwarf coat, he lent to the museum at Mickle Delving. And then his old cloak and hood, he left in a drawer. And the ring, he keeps on a chain in his pocket. Yeah. And the story will begin on his 111th birthday.
Very cool.
So the only thing we have left to talk about then is what account of the Hobbit are we reading here? All right.
Yes.
This is like the note on the Shire records at the end.
Right.
Which this is like extremely confusing. But
well, yeah, I wanted to comment on it briefly just because.
Well, hold on. We gotta make sure you don't give spoilers. We're gonna do.
I'm not. I'm talking broadly.
Okay. Yeah.
Regardless of the complexities of what he goes on to say, it was I think, very clever strategy, because he is intentionally or unintentionally, we don't really know, pulling the reader right away into this, like, kind of what I was saying earlier, like the archaeology of the texts. Like, he's pulled the reader out of the position of just readership. Like, they've already participated in, like, examining part of one edition, and are now finding new parts of the story. So it's like he's opened this, like, window of discovery or something.
He's acting like somebody in Middle Earth is the author of this.
Right, exactly.
We're going to dive into who this is right now.
And that the hypothetical reader is the one discovering this, not just being told something by Tolkien.
Yeah.
Which is a very clever strategy that I think is, like, from a fantasy standpoint, very effective at, like getting people excited about all of these, like, strange nuances.
Right, but we're going to answer this in a second. But how do you reconcile that with, you already have a book out where you didn't really do that, or you did the opposite of that? You might think. Should we do a vague thing, or should we just say there's a bunch of spoilers, so don't listen to this if you don't want spoilers? What should we do? Explanation there.
Yeah, I would say let's just go ahead and say it, and anyone who doesn't want any spoilers should not listen.
Okay, yeah. So this is, maybe I'll put it in a section, like if you want to listen to the end of the episode in case we read your review, I'll put a time in here where you should skip to. For no spoilers, skip to minute 51:40-ish. Okay. All right. So anyways, here's the deal. I took very good notes on this section because I want to be very clear and thorough about this. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I didn't bold anything. I was bolding a bunch of stuff in the other parts so they knew what to read. All right, so we're talking about the end of the Third Age here, which are like the great events of Lord of the Rings. And so the Shire becomes part of the reunited kingdom. So this is like, once Gondor and Arnor are reunited and set up, and the guy who becomes king, I guess we don't have to do all spoilers. So the guy that becomes king in Return of the King, he's the king of the reunited kingdom. Okay.
Right.
Hobbits. So after this, hobbits start to write down all their oral histories and their lore of everything. So like before that point, it's like, okay, they've been like, Shire reckoning had started once they moved to the Shire, but now it's like, okay, let's actually get real books and let's be real historians instead of just like, half-assing it. By the end of the first century of the Fourth Age, they now have many libraries. Okay. This account of Lord of the Rings is mainly drawn from the Red Book of Westmarch, preserved at Undertowers by the Fair Barons. Okay, so the Red Book is what Bilbo wrote in to write his Hobbit story. Mm-hmm. After that, Frodo wrote a bunch of stuff, most of Lord of the Rings, pulling from Merry and Pippin's accounts and Sam's accounts and probably Aragorn and Legolas's accounts and stuff, Right. And then Sam finished it off once Frodo left, right? Right. Okay. And then the Fairburns, I believe, are because a century later, Sam's already going to be dead. Mm-hmm. But the Fairburns are, I think his oldest daughter gets married to a Fairburn, so I think it's them. Okay. I'm kind of going mostly from memory here. All right. Okay. So the Red Book is, in origin, Bilbo's private diary that he takes to Rivendell. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Frodo brings it back to the Shire and adds account. Sorry, I guess I'm just reading my notes. But yeah, Frodo brings it back to the Shire and adds account of the War of the Ring throughout 1420 and 1421. So those are the years that Frodo gets back right before he leaves, because when he gets back, he's only there like 2 years before he leaves, before he goes on the boat. Remember? So there's 4 volumes total. Hobbit is 1, 3 for Lord of the Rings, just like we have Fellowship, Two Towers, Return of the King, right? Mm-hmm. And then plus there's an appendices volume, which is in Return of the King. The original Red Book is not preserved. All right, so it's not like we're just reading Bilbo and Frodo's firsthand account of it. Mm-hmm. But many copies are made, especially of the first copy. So that means of the first book of The Hobbit. So they particularly just go word for word of what Bilbo wrote. So what you're actually reading in The Hobbit is Bilbo's own voice, and that's why it sounds so childlike. Right. Meanwhile, the copy of the Red Book, like a copy of it, so again, not the original one, is brought to Gondor, which is, that's like basically Paris or Rome. Yeah. Like a great city, in the medieval ages, or in the Renaissance almost.
Grand city of knowledge. And everything.
Yeah. So that's brought there, and so it's copied down and edited by the scribe Findegeld in the Fourth Age, 172. So now we're like 150 years removed-ish from the events of Lord of the Rings. Right. And so he made reductions, corrected some Elvish stuff, added special accounts of Gondor. So, he basically filled in the gaps of Frodo's knowledge, but he edited Frodo's work, Right. And so that's why it's like, all right, well, now, the prologue, this Finnegal guy, he's writing for people in Gondor, right?
Right.
And so he's like, so these people in Gondor, they were like, yeah, we heard about how this hobbit destroyed a ring and everything, but it's like, how the hell did hobbits do it, you know? And it's like, what's there to them? They just seem like little pudgy guys, and it's like, they've always actually been brave, you know, like that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning there. Like they've always been brave, but you know, this is how you kind of explain it. And then he also had translations from Bilbo, translations from the Elvish, which I think Bilbo was supposed to have written the Silmarillion too, but we don't have to really get into that.
Okay.
And so I think he translates that as well. But I think Bilbo was working off, Elrond lived for part of it, but I think he was also working off Elendil, if anybody knows who that is. All right, anyways, yeah. So Bilbo's stuff is basically left intact, which is why The Hobbit is childish, and it was just made for kids, and even like Gondor or something. But then Frodo's account is heavily edited by this Finnegal guy in Gondor, and that's what we're supposed to be reading.
Okay.
Pretty cool.
Yeah. So point being, The Lord of the Rings is more like the writing of a scholar or a scribe, translating and compiling.
From 1,000 years ago.
Right. It's maybe a second order narrative, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas The Hobbit is intended to be much more autobiographical.
All right, Clifford. End of the prologue episode. Do you remember much about that one?
No.
We recorded it back in like early August or July.
Okay.
It's a long time ago.
It has definitely been a long time ago.
What's all our social media stuff? We haven't said that in like 20 episodes probably.
Okay.
Talking Tolkien Podcast is the website. Still
is that talking, fully spelled out, talkingtolkienpodcast.com?
Yeah. And then the Twitter is at Tolkien Talking, because I had screwed that up. and then
the Instagram is Talking Tolkien Podcast, just like the website.
Nice.
Isn't one of them like talking without a G?
I thought we thought about that, but we didn't actually do that.
Okay. Anyways, sorry to confuse everyone. TalkingTolkienPodcast.com, at Tolkien Talking, and Talking Tolkien Podcast for Instagram. And we're on Spotify, Audio Boom. What else?
Yeah, iTunes, obviously.
iTunes.
And then I'm seeing, like, on the thing, like, I'm just seeing, like, people have random access to this thing, like, beyond those normal ones. Besides Spotify and Apple and Stitcher. Like, there's other ones that they're just, like, other category. And it's like, whoa, how are people finding this? But whatever, it's cool.
Yeah.
We will never discourage people from listening. All right, but we got a 5-star review here. Remember, of course, 5 stars, that's the key. You get a nice beer koozie as a prize. You should totally write a review. It gets read out on the show because we don't get many reviews. But this one comes from Creef, exclamation point. Side note, I probably know who this is, but I'll read the review first. All right. So, talking about Talking Tolkien. Great podcast. I've already read The Hobbit, but have found this podcast to be great for finding out more about the background to the story and characters. I really appreciate Clifford's ability to make sense of the geography of Middle-earth. Pat's pretty good, too. Can't wait for Lord of the Rings. Thanks, guys. Okay. So I'm pretty sure Creef would be my college roommate, Ryan Moncrief, who sometimes he was known, like on, what is it? It wasn't Strava. What was before Strava? Running to Win. He was known as Creef Fontaine, according to himself. But yeah, and he just, so yeah, Moncrief, you can send me an email. Actually, I'll probably just text you, but send me an email and you can get your beer koozie. Dude, notable. Moncrief just went, looks like 2:23 in the Chicago Marathon this past week or so ago. Yeah. Nice job, buddy. Nice job. That is fast. That is flying.
Yeah. Wow.
I think he was doing more training than you, though.
Yeah, probably.
not the 40 miles a week. You got anything else?
I do not.
We're on a pretty regular schedule here. Yeah, I assume we'll just go through the whole book 1, which is the first half of the Fellowship, and then maybe we'll take like a short break, just to follow the books. But yeah, we should be rolling through this because I'm pretty on top of notes. Clifford's probably gonna finally get into a routine for finally.
I'm back in action.
So I don't know. I guess expect more. Leave us a review. Thank you for listening.
Yes, indeed.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks, y'all.